Welcome to Module 2 of U.S. History 1302. For this module, we'll be covering three chapters. Chapter 16, Capital and Labor, Chapter 18, Life in Industrial America, and Chapter 19, American Empire. So we're starting off with looking at the Industrial Revolution in America. It's a period of time also known as the Gilded Age, because we have a lot of prosperity, we have a lot of wealth being built, we have a massive increase in the size of our economy. But if you look close, there's a lot of problems and there's a lot of bad things. And so that's the capital half. That's the capitalists, the industrial leaders, the captains of industry. And then on the other side, you have the workers, the laborers, the people who are working in these factories. And this is the beginning of a time whenever they begin to come together to create the American labor movement, which will help get us things like 8-hour work week, safer working conditions, better pay, helping to end child labor, things like that. And then Life in Industrial America will focus much more on what life is like in the cities. And then finally, we'll get into American imperialism, which is the continuation of America's manifest destiny. Once we have taken over the whole continent, now instead of stopping, we just continue and we go and create a world empire. We begin taking over other countries, other nations, and territories, all for more markets, more resources to help feed this growing capitalist economy. So, starting off with, we have the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is important because this shows the importance of organizing. So 1877, as we learned in the Reconstruction chapter, was a time of a economic depression, or as it was known back then, a panic. The Panic of 1877 was caused by a collapsing bank. It was overextended because of railroads. So when you have economic depressions and panics like this, one of the ways that businesses will deal is by cutting wages and working hours for those employees. And so that's exactly what they did. The workers on the railroad will respond by decoupling trains and going on strike across various northeastern cities in the US. Now, even though this did take place in multiple cities, it was not a unified thing. They did not have any sort of leadership. They were not part of a national union. They were only part of more smaller local unions. And so there was no real leadership. And when the police and National Guard came in along with strike breakers, they were able to break up this strike, and there will be fighting, sporadic fighting. There will even be some arson where millions of dollars of railroad equipment will be destroyed. And ultimately, the strike will end thanks to the government coming in and forcing it to end, but also, again, because there was no unified leadership. There was no national labor union. And so it's one thing to try to fight for better wages, it's another thing to try to fight for better working conditions and things like that. But if you are going to do that, it's good to have organizations. It's good to have larger unions. So there's a leadership. You're speaking with one voice, and everybody's in the same place. And so that will be a change that comes after this, as we'll begin developing larger national labor unions. Now, one of the things that this was in response to was our economic change, which is our second word. So we have industrialization, the growth of manufacturing capitalism in the United States. Started in Britain, moved over to the United States, heavily pushed by things like coal and the development of factory systems throughout, especially the Northeast, where we had a lot of material resources you need, like coal and iron. We have this big change where we go from the majority of people living and working on farms to now living in cities and working in factories. So we have two major changes: industrialization, urbanization. And so for most of our history, the vast majority of people have been working on farms. But now, with the growth of factories, you need a lot of workers and you need people to do these jobs. So you will have people leaving farms and leaving other countries in the world to come to America in order to work in these factories. You also have another major change that happens because of this, which is due to the way our economy works. The man who created this idea of capitalism that we follow in our country is a man named Adam Smith, published The Wealth of Nations. In the book, he argues that if we have an economy completely uncontrolled by the government, unrestrained by the government, where everybody does what is best for them and what will help make them the most money, we will all be better off. So instead of the old system where the economy is controlled by the king, by the government in order to enrich the king, you instead have an economy where the main driver is profit, is this desire for more money, this desire for profit. And then Smith said we would all be better off. And part of this is what he called laissez-faire, this idea that the government would not control over the economy, not have a say, sort of like hands off. And then again, we would all do better. But as it turns out, when you have pure capitalism, you have what is known as monopolization, where companies begin taking over other companies in order to reduce competition and make more money for themselves. And that is actually really bad for multiple reasons, which we'll get into. So, what happens, as it turns out, in industrial capitalism, when you have these laissez faire policies, companies begin to eliminate their competition by buying them up and making more money. So laissez-faire policies lead to monopolization. So that is something that will change eventually as we realize, oh, competition is good and we need to protect it. Our next term is mass production economies of scale. So in the olden days, if you wanted a tool or a particular product, you would get it from someone like an artisan, someone who trained their entire life on how to produce this particular kind of tool or object, like a blacksmith who would produce a tool made out of metal, or a cobbler who produces shoes. And so people would train their entire lives learning how to make shoes for many, many years as an apprentice. And then once they reached a certain level, then they would be able to go basically become their own cobbler, open their own business. And then when you have the introduction of factories, instead of having a small group of people who are trained in one particular thing, you can instead have lots of people doing smaller portions of the job. So instead of one person making a shoe, you would have a person each making a different part of that shoe. And then by the end, you would have the complete shoe. But because you don't have to train them very much and because you have a lot of people working on it, you can produce way more shoes than a cobbler working on their own. So that reduces the cost of that item. And that's when factories and mass production really becomes a thing. And so in economics, you have this term economies of scale, where the more you produce, the cheaper each item becomes. And so while factories are very, very expensive to start up, once you start producing them, you can produce your product a lot cheaper than one person who's producing, a shoe at a time. And so it's in the interest of these businesses and these corporations to build up, hire a lot of people, and begin to produce as much as possible, which greatly increases the amount of things that we can buy. and also increases the number of workers that we need, but it decreases their prices. Eventually, those factory made goods will replace all of these artisans and all of these people who spend their entire lives working on just one thing. Now, like I said, factories are very expensive. And so you need money to build that initial factory. So one of the ways that people did this was through creating what's known as a corporation, which is our next term. A corporation is a legal designation where you create this identity outside of a single person. And so this is really good for creating legal protections and financial protections, but also inviting business and investment. So if you want to create your own business, if you want to create your own little shop or a food truck or any sort of business, it's a good idea to go to the government, pay a small fee, and become a corporation. And then you can get access to business accounts, you can get access to investors and funding, and all of these things to help you grow your company. And it's especially important in factories and things like that because you're going to need and you're going to want as much money as possible to help you grow your business. But also, corporations are good because if there is any sort of problem, if you go bankrupt, if your company collapses, if you get sued or whatever, that separate organization, that separate legal entity that is a corporation, is the target of it and not you. So if you go and create this business and your business goes bankrupt, they can't come and take your house or they can't come after your personal fortune or whatever. So these are really important. But also, during this time, especially, it allows people to invest capital, and capital is just another word for money. Again, going back to capitalism being based on the idea of profit, money. So we've got corporations, economies of scale, major economic changes in form of industrialization. You can see in this cartoon in the top left that the industry leaders, these powerful men, these capitalists, are represented with top hats and suits, and their bodies are literally giant bags of money. And this is the time period when and political cartoons are going to be really important because not everybody can read, but newspapers are becoming more common, and you're having a lot of people moving to the US. And so this becomes a way to sort of communicate what's going on without necessarily being able to read that well, since a lot of immigrants coming to America during this time do not speak English or read. You have these rich and powerful that are literally sitting on bags of money, and they're surrounded by all of their workers. And you can see here, working for a clothes worker for $9 a week, linen worker for $11 a week, lumber for 6, and they're literally forming a wall of protection around them to protect them from hard times because when the economy is bad, when there's problems, what they're going to do is cut their wages, cut their hours, but the rich and powerful will not suffer. And again, that is continued well into this day. On the top right, you have an image of a factory town. You can see the smokestacks. This is when our primary form of power was coal. And so it's very dirty, disgusting sort of power, produces a lot of coal dust and waste and smoke. So these chimneys were very important to try to keep it away from the factories. You have a railroad going right through the middle of it because that was the primary way to transport things. Remember, this is before automobiles, this is before trucks were a thing. So there was really only horse and foot. And then thankfully, with the invention of train, we can move a lot more resources. We have a graph in the bottom left corner that talks about economies of scale. Again, the more you produce up to a certain point, the less each item costs. And so when you find out how much you can produce for how much investment you have in as large of a factory you have versus how much you can sell, that's when you determine how much you want to produce. And then we have a couple images here that just kind of look at corporations. You have Corporation could be anything from, a small local business to a big, massive corporations. They're all considered legal entities, and they larger ones, especially, are run by boards like the one pictured in the bottom right. And as I sort of mentioned with laissez faire before, you have what's known as the Great Merger Movement, which is our next term. These companies realized fairly early on that if there's another company that's producing the exact same thing as me, instead of just trying to outcompete them and constantly produce a cheaper and newer product, it's just better off if I just buy that company or force them out of business so that I am the only business in this industry. Because one of the things that Smith argued about capitalism that was good is that there would be competition, that there would always be people trying to produce cheaper products and produce better products so that people would buy them instead of the other product. But when it comes to actual industrial capitalism, what ends up happening is monopolization because the investors, the stockholders, the ones who actually control the company, they don't want to compete. They don't want to lose money. They want to make as much money as possible. And they realize the best way for them to do that is to buy up the competition. And so they begin performing monopolies. Businesses will also form trusts, which is where multiple companies come together and basically say, we're going to charge the same thing, or we're going to charge something very similar and produce similar products so that no person gets too much control over the market. And again, we can all keep the benefit. So this monopolization, this mergers are really good for the investors and really good for the corporations, but not great for the consumer, not great for the economy, because why bother producing a new thing? Why bother spending the money to make a new way to do something when instead you can just keep producing the same thing, charge whatever you want for it, and make as much money as possible? The industry leaders we typically think of during this period are men like John D. Rockefeller, who was an oil tycoon, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who controlled a lot of railroads, J.P. Morgan, who is a very, very rich and powerful banker, and then Andrew Carnegie, who we'll talk about a lot more, which is the owner of Carnegie Steel and eventually richest man in the world. He is an example of what we might call a robber baron. These men, like most rich and powerful people, will do whatever they can to get that power, to get that wealth, and whatever they need to do to be successful. And as we'll talk about later with Carnegie, this involves sometimes not caring if your employees get hurt or die. In fact, in one instance, Carnegie will even call in a private security force to kill some of his striking workers. You have a lot of these people who are solely focused on making as much money as possible, and they don't care who gets hurt. And so they are compared to barons like those back in the Middle Ages who would literally rob their people and rob the people that are supposed to be under their protection in order to make as much money for them. Another term you might hear to describe these men is captains of industry or capitalists. Again, what you decide to call them typically depends on how you view them. If you focus on, wow, they were able to do these amazing things and build these massive companies, you might call them captains of industry. But if you realize that they hurt a lot of people, destroyed a lot of lives, and did a lot of terrible things to get where they are, then you might refer to them as robber barons. Moving on to our next term, social Darwinism, taken from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. Some in this period of history will try to apply the same ideals to our human society. The idea being that in actuality, if you are at the top of society, if you are successful, then that is because you deserve it, because you are better than anyone else. And so we're taking this idea that Charles Darwin observed in the wild and trying to apply it to our artificial human society. And it really should be known as survival of the richest. Because what it's basically saying is if you are rich, you deserve it. If you're poor, likewise, you deserve it. And so this is used as a way to explain away inequality, as a way to say, that's just the way society is. We don't need to bother to fix anything. We don't need to provide any sort of charity or welfare for people who are struggling. They just need to stop being so lazy. They just need to get a job, work hard. And if you are, at the bottom of society, then you deserve it. You shouldn't be so lazy. You shouldn't be so unethical. Or, in the case of some, they believed that those at the bottom were biologically lesser and deserved their position in society. And so, social Darwinism is used to excuse things like racism, sexism, and discrimination, but also to try to stop any sort of social welfare or charity, with the main goal, of course, of the rich and powerful being able to keep as much of their power and as much of their wealth as possible. Basically saying, don't raise my taxes to pay for people's food. Don't do that. They deserve it. And I deserve my money. And so they make up this idea to try to against this idea. And this will eventually turn into things like eugenics, which is, oh, not only do the people at the bottom deserve to be in that position, not only do the people at the top deserve to be in that position, but also only certain people should have children. Only certain people should breed. And in fact, we will make it impossible for certain people to breed. And then some people take this a little step further. Let's argue a lot further and say, actually, some people shouldn't exist and we should remove these people from society one way or another. We have social Darwinism leading into eugenics, survival of the fittest, survival of the richest, becoming actually only survival of those we deem worthy, and then eventually elimination of those we deem unworthy. But this is an American idea that eventually gets exported to other places around the world. Our next term, industrial working conditions, as I've sort of alluded to, you have a lot of people moving to the cities who are desperate for jobs. You have immigrants moving to America, desperate for a better life because of things they're experiencing back in the old world. And unfortunately, because there is this movement, because there is a lot of people moving to cities, a lot of these jobs, a lot of these places are like, well, we don't have to pay people a lot. We don't have to treat them right because they're very easy to replace. Like, oh, if a worker dies or gets injured, that's fine. We'll just go get somebody else to replace them because there's a ton of people looking for jobs. And so in these factories, there's no safety measures, there's no sort of protections for these workers. And so every day you could be taking your life into your hands, and there's no guarantee that when you leave to go to work in the morning that you're going to make it back home alive or in one piece. That there was really not another option. And again, because the government is all laissez-faire, no government intervention, that also means no regulation, no safety, no protection or help for those who are injured or killed on the job. This also extends to children. We have laws today that say you can't hire children under a certain age. And if you do, they can only work a certain amount of hours. And we also have things like a minimum wage. Even though the minimum wage is far too low to actually make a living today, it is still something that we did not have back then. And it is expected to have, if you work over certain hours today, you're supposed to have overtime. That did not exist. You could be made to work 12, 16-hour shifts. And again, if you died or you were injured, well, that's fine. We'll have somebody else. And again, not above using child labor. And if we hire women or children or immigrants, we can pay them less than a white American man. So a lot of places will employ immigrants and children and women for those reasons, but also children have an extra reason to be employed because they're smaller and so they can fit into places that adults cannot, which is very useful when you have machines because they can go in and they can make adjustments and they can make repairs. And if they happen to get an arm or a leg or finger ripped off, that's fine. They probably have a brother or sister who can come. Again, there's absolutely no care or respect for human life. And you constantly have death and injury and people who are wounded and unable to work basically for the rest of their life. And there's no social welfare system, there's no food stamps, there's no nothing like that. They just basically become a beggar or die for the rest of their life. There's no option for them. And it's these terrible working conditions that will again inspire people to work hopefully towards a better future. And it is people bringing attention to these terrible living conditions that will eventually lead to the first laws that eventually end child labor and that work to make places safer and hold businesses accountable for the safety of their workers. But back then, that did not exist. That was not a thing until people started fighting for it. So we have the robber barons. You have literally J.P. Morgan dressed up as a king, and Rockefeller and Carnegie in steel armor, like old robber barons, like old kings of old. You have literal robber barons dressed up in the top. You have John D. Rockefeller, who was the richest man in the world and one of the richest men to ever live throughout human history. His wealth has only recently been surpassed, and so it's not incorrect to say that he was richer and more powerful than some kings and other leaders around the world. At one time, Standard Oil, his company, controlled 92% of all oil production in the United States, which is why you can see them pictured here as an octopus, as he was using his wealth and power as these leaders, as rich people typically do, use their wealth, use their power, use their influence to influence the government. And you can see here now the Standard Oil octopus reaching for the White House, where it already has control of Congress, lawyers, and state houses. So, again, you have the capital side, you have the industrialization side, and then on the other side, you have the workers. There are, again, no protections. There's no overtime. There's no minimum wage. There is, in fact, you're going to get paid. You're going to get paid a terrible wage. You're going to work incredibly long hours. You're going to have to work 6 days a week. And again, there's no real hope of anything better except through our next term, unionization. Joining a union in order to try to improve your working conditions, get better hours, and better pay. So there's several different tools of unionization. The most obvious ones, the ones that typically get the most attention, are, of course, strikes. This is when people stop working in order to basically force their businesses, force their bosses and jobs and companies to give into their demands, to give them more money, to give them better working conditions. You can also do boycotts. This is when you ask other people not to buy from that business in order to put more pressure on the owners and the leaders. And then there's picketing, which usually goes in between both. This is where you have people standing outside of businesses holding signs and saying, "Don't shop here, my boss is, horrible to us," or whatever. Um, and one of the reasons that the Great Railroad Strike, as I mentioned before, failed was because there was no leadership. There was no one voice, no one group arguing for better treatment. And because there is no legal protection for unions or laborers, and because the wealthy and powerful use their wealth and power to influence the government, many police and courts and the government will always side with big businesses against laborers and strikers. But that will begin to change as you have these unions that eventually joined together to create larger national and state level unions. They began to get more power, more authority, and they began advocating for, again, better working conditions and things like that. One of the first ones is our next term, the Knights of Labor. They're very successful in the 1880s. They'll have over 700,000 workers by 1886. They will let in whether skilled or unskilled workers. They even let in women. Their goal is to get as many people into their union as possible, to get as large a group as possible, try to spread their influence and work towards their goals. Though initially successful, unfortunately, the Knights of Labor Union will come to an end after what's known as the Haymarket Affair. In May of 86, there will be a bunch of workers on strike in Chicago, and there will be protesters outside of the Haymarket, literally a place where you go and buy hay for your horses, which was one of the primary modes of transportation at the time. And so the Knights of Labor will call for another strike the next day. And when police try to break it up, someone, we don't know for sure if it was a member of the Knights of Labor, if it was just another person involved. The next day, when police try to break up this protest, someone throws a bomb that ends up killing 7 policemen, who then fire into the crowd, killing 4. Though we don't know for sure who threw the bomb or whether they were members of the Knights of Labor, they will end up getting the blame, and 5 organizers, members of the Knights of Labor, will be labeled as anarchists, tried, and executed. Those on the labor side will view these people as martyrs, as people who died for what they believed in. But for many, they saw the Knights of Labor as radical. And so, unfortunately, the Knights of Labor will collapse. But we still need this sort of larger national organization. So we'll get a new, larger union known as the American Federation of Labor, which only allows in skilled workers. So these are, again, not going to allow in everybody. They're not going to allow in certain groups, but they will begin focusing on more conservative, more negotiations, and having better relationships with business owners and leaders. And they're still going to be fighting for safer working conditions, fewer hours, and higher wages. They just aren't as going. They're trying to avoid this label that the Knights of Labor got as being incredibly radical, which ultimately led to them being dissolved. So we have some examples of a picket, a protest. You have these labor marchers holding signs. You have the original seal of the American Federation of Labor on the bottom left, which still represents 2 hands grasping, shaking hands. You have this cartoon that shows sort of the labor movement joining together, the workers joining together to create something stronger. The main goal of the labor movement was to create a normal 8-hour workday, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for whatever, which, again, is something that has not been around for very long. And we have this painting here that shows the explosion with the police were killed, and then they started firing into the crowd at the Haymarket Affair that ended the Knights of Labor. So the Haymarket Affair was simply one of the first major pieces of violence, but it's not the only. We have, of course, as I mentioned, the Great Railway Strike, but one of the most consequential will be the Homestead Strike. This is going to be our old friend Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel, the largest steel producing company in the US at the time, and is based in the Northeast, the industrial center of the country. Carnegie used monopolization, vertical integration to buy up everything involved in producing steel, from the mines to the trains to the ships. And this meant that he had a lot of control over his people, over his workers, over his product. And when the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers decided to go on strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania, due to wage cuts, Carnegie will hire a private security force known as the Pinkerton Detective Agency to go in and break up the strike. Now, the Pinkertons will do this a lot for several different of these rich and powerful leaders. You also, of course, have the National Guard, the police, and the army that'll go in and break up strikes at various points. But this is at first a major victory for the labor leaders, because when the Pinkertons attempt to enter Homestead, Pennsylvania by barge, they are ambushed and taken hostage and forced to surrender to the strikers. And this sort of shows that they do have power to fight back, and that it is such a shock that eventually the Pennsylvania governor will send in the militia to break the strike and reopen the mill. But once again, it shows that these people can come together and they can fight and they can begin to make some progress. And so this is one of the first times where, even though they are not completely successful, they do manage to fight back. Another important historical strike is the Pullman strike in 1894. Pullman at the time is known for its very luxurious train cars, but the actual leader, Pullman, who owns the company, was an incredibly ruthless businessman, and he was not very nice to his workers. And the way that he ran his company is he required his workers to live in what's known as a company town, where the apartments that they would live in and rent are owned by him. The grocery stores and all the shops in the area would be owned by him. And so even though he's paying their wages, they're basically turning around and giving all that money back to him. So it was very, very difficult for them to leave Pullman or escape. And in 1894, when he reduces their wages, if it doesn't cut their rent, a bunch of Pullman workers go on strike. Following that, you also have another union, the American Railroad Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, will go on a sympathy strike, refusing to work on Pullman cars. So this is an example of one labor union supporting another. And the Illinois governor is going to be one of the few government officials at the time who does not immediately step in and stop the strike. He's actually very sympathetic to the workers and will not send in the militia. But another way that they have, besides sending in the militia and police forces and things like that, is by going to court. And again, because there is no legal framework for striking and for unionizing, uh, the judge will declare that the strike needs to end through what's known as an injunction. And when they refuse, Eugene Debs is arrested, not for the last time in his life. He'll be arrested multiple times. As a labor organizer and future Socialist Party presidential candidate, Debs will be fighting for labor and not afraid to put himself on the line. President Cleveland will also send in the army to break up the strike. So once again, even though the strike is not successful, we are beginning to change people's minds. We finally have a governor in a very important state of Illinois that is siding with labor unions. And so we will begin to have more representation, more government support for unionization and labor. But one group that really felt like they were left out by everybody was farmers. So we have had the settlement of the Great Plains through the Homestead Act. You have a lot of people moving out there and getting these farms. It didn't cost a lot of money, but it was incredibly hard, incredibly backbreaking work in order for them to be successful. But now, with the creation of the railroads, they can sell their goods and they can sell their crops to places back east, which really need the food, of course, because they have all these people moving in. However, because there is no government regulation and because there is basically no incentive to be nice to anybody and to make as much money as possible, many railroads will take advantage of these farmers and charge them incredibly high fees in order to transport their goods to market. You also have larger farms that'll buy up land from farmers and are able to produce more. And again, thanks to the economies of scale, they can sell their stuff for cheaper. So that's going to be even worse for farmers. But in the way that our economy is even set up is bad for farmers. Back then, the US dollar was tied to gold and what's known as the gold standard, where unlike today, where a dollar is worth a dollar because we say it's worth a dollar and because the government says it's worth a dollar and we all sort of agree to it, back then, a dollar was actually worth a certain amount of money or a certain amount of gold. So you could take your dollar and turn it into the bank and get a certain amount of gold for it. Um, and this is really good for banks. It keeps the economy fairly stable and you don't have a lot of inflation, but it's bad for farmers, especially because they are working with such small, minute amounts of product and money. A bushel of wheat is not even going to be worth, penny at that time. And so you would be operating in percentages of pennies and percentages of dollars. And it was just very difficult for farmers. And they also had been saddled with a lot of debt thanks to mechanization. And so farmers will organize what's known as the Farmers Alliance to fight for protections against railroads charging too much money, protections against large farms reducing prices too much, and also one of the main pushes that will actually end up failing is this push for the coinage of silver. So by having U.S. currency that's not just backed by gold, but also currency backed by silver, you would have what's known as deflation, and this is really good for farmers, but not necessarily good for banks. So of course, it doesn't happen. Eventually, the Farmers Alliance will become what's known as the Populist Party. Populist is a term that basically means of the people. These are people appealing to the everyday man, everyday people, and especially at a time when many felt like they were being left behind by the Democrats and the Republicans. Remember, the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, they were really, really popular um, among certain groups. Obviously, African Americans supported the Republicans for a long time because they were the party of the great emancipator. Democrats, however, mainly focused on stripping back African Americans of their rights. They're mainly in the South, which it doesn't have a lot of industry, doesn't have a lot of workers, and it's still kind of stuck in the past. They're still trying to rebuild after the Civil War, but they don't want to have too much change. And Republicans are the parties of the cities, of the urban, of the factory owners, and they sort of leave out this huge section of the economy, these workers, these farmers and others. And so they will create a third party because they feel like they're not being represented by the main Democrat and Republican Party. So you have the Populist Party. Here you have on this page some images. You have the Pullman strike. You have this battle that happens in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the bottom right. You have Pullman. You can see him literally squeezing his worker between low wages and high rent. Again, he's wearing that top hat and suit that is the uniform of the rich and powerful at the time. And you have the Farmers Alliance here. You have their flag, and you have this hot air balloon representing the growth of the Populist Party being put together of all these different groups that sort of feel left out by the main groups, and this image in the newspaper where Uncle Sam, representing the government, is sort of being shown by this populist politician. Look at all these people who you are not paying attention to. Look at all these people who you're ignoring. In order to become a political party, become a president, you have to have a set of beliefs. That's usually referred to as a platform. So every year during an election, you'll have the Democratic Party platform, the Republican Party platform, or what is the candidate's platform. And so In 1892, the Populist Party will put forth what's known as the Omaha Platform. Omaha is, of course, the capital of Nebraska, which is a majority farm state even to this day. They have several goals. They want direct election of senators. Remember, in the Constitution, senators were elected by state legislators, not by the people like they are today. And so this would give them hopefully more control over the government, more say in the government. And so that's why they really wanted to push for this idea. They also, as I mentioned, wanted unlimited coinage of silver, which would create more money and be better for farmers. They also wanted to create what's known as a graduated income tax. At the time, the primary way the government paid for itself and provided things for the country was through tariffs. Tariffs are really bad for farmers because one of the things they can do if they can't sell their goods here in America, they can sell them overseas. And so they really wanted to get rid of that, but also the Populist Party is asking for the government to step in and provide certain benefits, provide regulations. That takes money. And one of the ways they wanted to do that was through an income tax. The income tax did not exist at this time. It will not come into fruition until the 1910s. And a graduated income tax basically means the richer you are, the more money you pay in taxes. And so, this idea that people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and these rich and powerful people should pay more in taxes is one of the things that they push for. They also are pushing for an 8-hour workday, again, trying to appeal to the workers. And to appeal to the farmers, they're also pushing for loans from the government, again, provided by that income tax, and warehouses to buy extra crops in order to stabilize farm prices. Again, because the small farmer is struggling, competing against all the big farms, but also to pay the tolls, the ticket prices, to send their goods on a train to market. In 1896, the Populist Party will have their great champion. But the way that American elections are set up, there's really not a place for a third party. Our system is set up basically for only two parties, which is why before the Civil War, we've only had the Democrats and the Republicans. And so one populist politician by the name of William Jennings Bryan will actually gain quite a bit of popularity. And in 1896, he will become the Democratic candidate for president. Now, Bryan is one of our great presidential losers in history, kind of like Henry Clay, the great negotiator we talked about before. He will run for president 3 times and lose every time. This is during a period from after the Civil War, from 1860 all the way until 1912. There's only one Democratic president. All the rest are Republicans. And so Bryan will run in 96. He will begin to change what it is to be a presidential candidate. One of the things he does that no other president before him did was travel around the country speaking to the American people, giving what was known as a stump speech. We generally expect a president to travel around and talk to people today to try to spread their word, but that was a very new thing. Again, this goes back to him being a man of the people and wanting to spread that message. Ultimately, he'll speak to about 5 million people in 27 states, but it's not enough for him to win. He will lose in 1896 and 1900 to President McKinley, and then he'll run for president again in 1908 and lose to Taft. Even though he is not successful, he will help popularize these political ideas, and these populist ideals will end up being taken by the Democratic and Republican parties and become law. One of the populist things that does not happen, though, is what's known as free silver or bimetallism. As I mentioned before, they want the populists, the farmers especially, wanted this other coinage, this coinage of silver dollar bills backed by silver. and in addition to gold. And hopefully that would help them do better. But ultimately, this would cause deflation. So the value of the dollar would go down because there would be more of it because it's backed by silver, which is, well, still a precious metal, still a lot more cheap than gold. This would help increase crop prices and help them pay off debt. But ultimately, because deflation is bad for banks and bad for businesses and people with money, it will never get passed. But it is one of the things that sort of helps lead to the end of the Populist Party because this is their biggest push, their biggest thing, and it gets everything else gets taken by the Democratic and Republican parties, but not free silver capitalism. Last term, Eugene Debs mentioned him earlier. He was the leader of the American Railroad Union. He will also be a leading socialist at the time in the country, labor leader. At one point, he will be arrested and end up running for president from prison, getting over 1 million votes. He's the most successful outright socialist candidate we've ever had in our country. This is back before the Red Scare, before socialism was a bad word. And he will also found the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, going back to this idea of creating a union of unions, of a bunch of different unions from different walks of life and different areas coming together to create a larger union. The Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, is all about uniting workers from across the world instead of just focusing on a single nation. Generally, the IWW is considered a very radical socialist organization and is still around today, even though labor movement and unions have sort of decreased in the last several decades due to various laws and pushes and the moving of manufacturing overseas. The IWW has continued to organize and get workers into the labor movement all across the world. So, our last slide for this chapter, we have the free silver bandwagon that has come off, that is separated and is rolling downhill because, again, that is not going to be successful. On the bottom left cartoon, you have William Jennings Bryan holding a cross of gold. This comes from one of his more well known speeches, but also most derided speeches, as he is called sacrilegious. You can literally see in this cartoon that he is standing on the Bible. This is part of his push to have silver be created and coined. And it created this sort of sacrilegious candidate view of him because he's using Christian imagery and biblical imagery to talk about government and policy, which at one time was considered a very bad thing. And you also have this image of Brian as a snake and the populist party consuming the Democratic Party, which is symbolized and still today symbolized by a donkey. And so, again, this is entering the period where political cartoons are very, very important. So, seeing him holding a sack of as cross of gold and standing on the Bible would have been a very effective way to kind of call him the sacrilegious candidate and speak out against it. And again, drawing him as a snake consuming the Democratic Party. The media at the time was obviously not on his side and did not like Brian. And then at the top, you have Eugene Debs and his Socialist Party formed from 1912. Again, being socialist was not necessarily a bad thing back then. It was just a party of the workers and trying to appeal for a better life and a better working conditions and improve workers' lives, what most socialists were fighting for. Continuing on with the Gilded Age, we're moving on to chapter 18, Life in Industrial America. We're going to be talking about what it's like to live in cities, some new technological developments, social developments that are happening in America at the time. Obviously, we talked about how railroads had become quite common. In the past, if you were wanting to move a lot of material across America, it would have to travel in horse and buggy. By you could put on a boat if you're lucky, and you can get it to as far as Chicago. You take it in, go from New York to the Great Lakes using the Erie Canal, but the rest of America is sort of cut off and very hard to get to, especially when we are settling the West. Places like Oregon, the Oregon Trail, it takes months to get to on with wagon and oxen or on foot. Now you can travel across the country in only a week on a train, and it would be relatively safe. You can also move vast amounts of material, which is important for not only creating a new interconnected market, but also fueling new industry that's happening in the East. Because that's the thing that capitalism and industrial economies certainly need is material. They need resources, they need fuel, they need metal, they need coal, they need all these things in order to run these factories and produce the goods that they to sell. We get with the spread of the railroads, we get a national market, Western expansion, and no longer are you just sort of stuck in the area that you are currently living in, and you can get resources from across the entire country. And vast distance no longer necessarily means as much as it used to, as you now have laborers, capital, and resources able to come from all over the country, all over the world, and move with great speed and efficiency. So the United States will become much more interconnected, much more industrial and advanced. We'll have more and more people moving to the country, and with that, the growth of economy. Moving on to our third term, electricity. We have to talk about one of these things that you've probably heard in some of your other history classes, and the main focus of that is going to be Thomas Edison. Now, you might have heard, of course, Edison invented the light bulb. Well, Edison wasn't actually an inventor. What Edison did do was hire inventors and then turn around and patent what they created. So, what he actually created was an electric company, and the light bulb was a way to sell that electricity. Previously, if you wanted to light your house, you had to have candles or gas lamps, and candles occasionally get knocked over and burn your house down. If you have gas lamps, you literally have natural gas being pumped into your house, and you would turn it on and light it, and that would create a gas light, usually very dim, not very good, and it would also create a lot of soot. And occasionally, if there was a leak or too much gas got out or something, or you blew out the light but forgot to turn the gas off, your house might explode. So it was dangerous and expensive. Again, occasionally would lead to entire blocks burning down by accident. And so the light bulb was much safer, and it was a great way for Edison to sell his electricity. There were originally different kinds of electricity, one pushed by Edison, another pushed by a famous inventor named Nikola Tesla. Edison, being a terrible, horrible businessman, much like Carnegie and Rockefeller, will lie and do lots of terrible things in order to ruin Tesla, including claiming that his electricity was dangerous while his was safer, which is not true. Electricity, either way, is both deadly but also incredibly safe if you're using it right. However, he will put Nikola Tesla out of business, force him into bankruptcy, and then become an incredibly rich and powerful man through the sale of, again, not light bulbs, but electricity, getting people to electrify their homes and electrify their businesses. That's the biggest thing, is allowing factories to run 24/7. No longer does it mean when the sun goes down, that means we go to sleep and we're no longer able to be productive because we don't have light. Now we have light 24/7, and that will really help boost this second industrial revolution. Again, goes into this idea of the Gilded Age, that we have this. It's, look at this brightness, look at this electricity, look at all these amazing things. But in actuality, there's a lot of not great things happening when you look at it closer. Uh, Moving on to urbanization, we talked about this last time, the growth of cities. Farmers and immigrants are moving to cities for jobs. but they're moving so quickly and so many of them that there's a lot of strain on city governments for services for things like running water, sewage, even basic infrastructure like roads and bridges and things like that. And that will lead to a lot of problems, which we'll talk about on the next slide after this one. If you look at these two images, you have railroads built by 1870, so that's like right after the Civil War. As you can see, there's a ton of railroads in the north. This is the more industrial section of the country. Places like New York and Boston and Chicago and even St. Louis are important manufacturing and industrial centers of the north. There's not nearly as many in the south. And by 1890, just 20 years later, there are railroads all over. They've even interconnected with places like Houston and Dallas. And we have, instead of just one railroad line going all the way across the US, we now have multiple railroad lines traveling the entire length of the US so we can move more people, more resources, and again, have a major connected and prosperous empire. You have the two great inventors of electricity, Thomas Edison at the top, not invent the light bulb, but patented it, and Nikola Tesla, pictured on the bottom, who Edison put out of business by making up a lot of lies and falsehoods about his electricity. And we now use a combination of both their types of electricity. And in the bottom left, you have a picture of Mulberry Street, which just sort of shows how jam packed and overwhelmed these cities are. Again, these streets we didn't have cars yet. So again, you have people and you have horses and markets. This just sort of shows how crazy and chaotic our cities were at the time with so many people moving and joining them from all over the world. And they grew, but we weren't really ready for them or expecting them. And that'll cause some problems. Again, we have a lot of immigrants coming into this country during this period, thanks to industrial capitalism. Millions will move from all over the world in order to get a job in our economy. And there's a difference, though, between these immigrants and the immigrants that came before. And the main way is that a lot of these new immigrants did not come from Western Europe. So most of the original immigrants into America were English or German or French, and they were all Protestant. And that's really important. Again, a lot of them came over here not for religious freedom, but in order to create their sort of religious haven. And was a lot of distrust of anybody who was different, anybody who didn't believe like they believed. And in the late 19th century and early 20th century, a lot of the people moving to America were likely going to be Jewish, Catholic, and did not speak English. So they could be from places like Italy or Poland or Ireland, places that have large Catholic populations. Poland was also one of the largest Jewish populations. And all of these places did not speak English. So there was a lot of anti immigrant feelings during that time and things like that. But also, there will be tons of people, in addition to the industrial capitalists who want to take advantage of these people. There will also be political bosses who want them to basically vote the way they want them to vote. That takes us into our next term, machine politics. These are local, like the Democratic Party of New York was probably one of the most infamous, also known as Tammany Hall, led by a man named Boss Tweed. These political machines would be the ones who would pick who ran for office, who got the money, who they told people to vote for. Today, we get to elect our candidates through a process known as primaries or caucuses, where, depending on what state you live in, Texas is a primary state, so we have an election before the election within our parties where we get to go vote on who we want to run for office in the main election. But back then, that was chosen by the party itself. And so you get these political bosses who begin abusing their position in order to make money for themselves and do so at the expense of everybody else. Again, this time period is a period where we realize maybe we do need to have a little bit of government control. Maybe we do need to have a little bit of government regulation, because if we just let everybody do what they want, a lot of people are going to do bad things. And a lot of people are going to take advantage of people. And so, one of the ways that political bosses took advantage of people was by convincing immigrants to vote for certain people. Basically, go vote for my candidate. And if my candidate wins, then I'll make sure your neighborhood gets roads or sewers or running water or something like that. Or I'll make sure that you get a job as long as you vote for my candidate. And the candidate they would have them voting for usually was a candidate who paid off that political boss, who bribed them or was a friend of theirs for whatever reason. And they also sometimes would even rig elections and stuff ballot boxes or use intimidation to force people to vote for who they wanted to or not vote at all in order to get the results that they wanted. So, again, a lot of bribery, a lot of corruption, and what we would call cronyism and nepotism, picking people that are your friends or family in order to take positions that you have control over instead of having legitimate elections. And moving on from the North, let's go back to the South. And so we have this. We talked about the New South, this desire to move on from the Reconstruction, move on from the Civil War, but at the same time, try to return stuff back to the way it was, or keep certain things the way they are. Big push for segregation. We're going to allow in a little bit of industrialization to move away from the agrarian economy, from a mostly farming economy, but not a lot. There will be very little industrialization happening in the South until after World War II. You also have white supremacy being entrenched into the law, even though you were supposed to have things like equality under the law with the 14th Amendment, and these formerly freed slaves are supposed to be able to vote. But these former Confederates, after they're pardoned by Andrew Johnson, will go in and strip away a lot of these rights. And the nickname for these laws that limit African American rights, that create segregation, is Jim Crow. Again, Jim Crow is not a person; it is the nickname for these laws. And this main idea of segregation is to keep the races separate in order to prevent any crossbreeding, prevent any mixed race children. And a lot of times the excuse was we have to protect our women from African American men. And so you will get these Jim Crow laws in the South that will keep the races divided, keep the races unequal, and maintain white supremacy. They will continue well into the 20th century, all the way until the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So we have on the top, we have images of political bosses. You have the brains that achieved the Tammany victory at the Democratic Convention. As you can see, his head is a sack of money. So obviously, the political cartoon is saying that it wasn't brains, it was money. You have a party boss handing out contracts and to rich people. You also have another one, smoking a cigarette and looking intimidating and saying that I basically, who does it matter who you're voting for, because I'm going to be the one counting the votes. So these are just different ways that we show that party bosses are controlling things and having more power than they should. And again, this goes back to political cartoons being a way to talk about the news, especially important for people who aren't that well read or able to read. Um, bottom left, you have a railroad yard, which again is very, very important for the growth of cities and industrialization. Immigrants coming to America. This is a scene that many coming from Eastern Europe would see as they enter into New York Harbor. They would see the Statue of Liberty before they go to Ellis Island. And then we have a example of a segregated fountain. In this instance, where you have a white fountain and a black fountain, you have white restrooms, black restrooms, restaurants, hospitals, waiting rooms, just all aspects of Southern life will be segregated according to Jim Crow laws. In addition to the law, another way that African Americans in the South were sort of kept in their place was through extrajudicial lynchings. So, again, extrajudicial meaning outside of the law. So, our next term, lynching, refers to basically killing people outside of violence. The main target of this lynching is going to be, of course, African American men. There's this myth perpetuated that all African American men want is a white woman, and so we have to protect white women from African American black men. And one of the ways they did this was by lynchings. If you were a black man in the South and you were accused of flirting with a white woman or touching a white woman or assaulting a white woman in any way, you would not get a trial. You would not have any chance to defend yourself. There would be a white mob that would come and take you and kill you. And it was a way to intimidate African Americans in the South, which is a form of terrorism. And because a lot of those in charge at the time, both the police and the judges and other leaders in the communities in the South, were either supporters of or sometimes even members of these mobs, they would not face justice. They would not be investigated or prosecuted. And so lynching will continue from the end of Reconstruction. There was, of course, quite common during Reconstruction as well, continue all the way until the 20th century. And although lynchings will continue well into the middle of the 20th century, there will be a great reduction in lynchings thanks to federal anti lynching laws. And the only reason that happened is thanks to a female reporter named Ida B. Wells. She was an African American journalist. Many journalists during this period are what's known as muckrakers. The idea that they sort of, dig in the muck and the dirty and the gross and expose it to the people of America so that they can try to fix it. They could try to make things better. And so her work will help advocate for federal anti-lynching laws. So even if you have, local governments and local police that are not prosecuting people who lynch African Americans, then you now have the federal government getting involved. And so this will end up reducing lynchings. But she will travel around the South and interview thousands of people and expose thousands of lynchings that will happen. And of course, all of them will go without punishment until these federal anti-lynching laws are finally passed. Moving on to our next term, voter suppression. Again, following the end of Reconstruction and withdrawal of federal troops, a lot of former Confederate leaders and racists and white supremacists in the South will restrict access to voting for African Americans after federal troops are gone and after Reconstruction ends. And so you'll go from this period where you have a lot of black leaders and a lot of congressmen and senators from the South to having almost none because of things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Now, even though the law says that we're all supposed to apply the law equally to everybody, many of these southern states will force African Americans to pay poll taxes while exempting white Southerners from paying by what's known as the grandfather clause. And they'll put in things in the law that basically said if you have if you had an ancestor who voted before 1865, then you don't have to pay this tax. You don't have to take this literacy test. But because 1865 is the year of the end of the Civil War, no African American in the South, especially, will have any ancestor who's ever voted. And so they will all have to pay these taxes, while white Southerners will not have to pay it and also not have to take literacy tests. Now, it makes sense that you would probably want somebody to be able to read if they're going to go vote. And so that's how you can pass laws like literacy tests. But once again, the main target of these literacy tests is going to be African Americans in the South. Not only will these tests be given to African Americans and not to white people, but also they will not provide access to equal education. In fact, most African Americans in the South will not receive any education or one nowhere near comparable to white Americans in the South. But even if you were a well educated Black person, there was no guarantee you would pass this test because many of these literacy tests were designed to be incredibly confusing, unclear, and basically, no matter what you try to do, even if you try to follow instructions, it would be either impossible to pass or it would be rigged so you couldn't pass at all. But if that didn't work, there was always terrorism, there was always the KKK and violence and intimidation in order to suppress the black vote in the South. And they would also use ballot stuffing to change the votes by putting in a bunch of false ballots and things like that. So, once again, things are not going very well in the South. And even though we're supposed to be moved on, we're supposed to have equal rights and equal laws for everybody in our country, that is not being extended to everyone as it should. So you have these images here, this image of a man being lynched, the shadow of a man being lynched over a white crowd. This flag that was flown in New York to show basically a man was lynched yesterday to help bring awareness to what's happening and help push for federal anti-lynching laws. You have this Ida B. Wells pictured in the bottom left corner. That is the woman who fought for federal anti-lynching laws and one of the first muckrakers. This image of African Americans voting in the top right, and this sign for poll taxes that again will stop them from voting, even though they had been voting in the years following the Civil War. Another result of the former Confederates, white supremacists, and people who are partial to the Confederacy gaining power in the South again is that they will attempt to rewrite history in what's known as the Lost Cause. So, the Daughters of the Confederacy is one group that is founded. These are women whose husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons will die in the Civil War. And they will begin erecting monuments, and they will even go on to write history textbooks that try to rewrite the Civil War as something not about slavery, but about something else. And they try to make it more heroic. They try to change the narrative about the Civil War and say that the Confederacy wasn't fighting for slavery, they were fighting for states' rights, or that the Confederacy was full of heroes and that slavery wasn't that bad. And people like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis are heroes and not traitors and racists and horrible, brutal people. So some of the main things that the Lost Cause will push is the idea that the Civil War was about about states' rights and not about slavery, which of course is not true. It was about whether or not they should be able to have slaves, and they were willing to break up the Union and found their own country in order to maintain slavery. They also would nickname the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression, even though the South started it at Fort Sumter. And they also would try to push ideas that kind of ignore a lot of the bad things about slavery, ignore the rape, ignore the beatings, the whippings, the splitting up of slave families, and denial of basic human rights by saying that actually slavery wasn't very bad. It wasn't violent, it wasn't horrible, and it was actually even good for slaves. It was good for them. And so this will become one of the prevailing teachings in the South, and there are places in the South and Georgia and other states that will continue to have textbooks that talk about this framing of the Civil War well into the 20th century. And there are people alive today who still believe these sort of things, that believe that the Civil War was about states' rights and not about slavery, and believe that slavery wasn't that bad, and might even call it the War of Northern Aggression, even though that is completely wrong and completely false. But again, by rewriting history, by trying to soften the image of the Confederacy and change it, they're trying to, again, make themselves feel better, but also help maintain that superiority, that white superiority and white supremacy in the South. Another big cultural thing that will help push this idea is what's known as the film Birth of a Nation. It comes out in 1915. It is all about the KKK, which we talked about in Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan. They are basically a terrorist organization that went around killing not only African Americans but anybody who was helping them, and they even assassinated politicians and leaders and members of the Freedmen's Bureau and other people coming from the North to help. And in 1915, this film will be released called Birth of a Nation, which redefines them not as a terrorist organization, but as defenders of white civilization. And the film has quite a lot of dubious things in it. Obviously, it's not true. It paints it's very pro KKK. Um, they'll use blackface to portray African American men as sexually aggressive towards white women, which is generally the thing that was used as an excuse for segregation and for lynching and other racist laws in the South. Um, because we got to protect our white women, we can't have mixed race babies. And it also has another dubious honor of being the first film ever shown at the White House by President Wilson, who was supposedly a progressive president, but was quite racist. So progressive as long as you're not black, basically. And it also will help revive the KKK and bring it back to national prominence. During the 19 teens and 20s, the KKK will resume and become a national organization, although a little bit different than the one in the past. So you have memorials like the one at the top of Stonewall Jackson. This is carved into a mountain in Georgia. You also have the revival of this symbol, which we call the Confederate flag, but it's not actually the Confederate flag because the Confederates never used this as a flag. It was a flag that was used by one battle group in Virginia, but it became the symbol of this pro Confederacy, of this lost cause, and of the KKK, when in reality it has nothing really to do with the Civil War. And by contrast, I wanted to include the last flag of the Confederacy from the Civil War, which was the dish towel that Robert E. Lee used to surrender to Grant, which now currently sits in the Smithsonian Museum. Um, and then you have this movie poster for Birth of a Nation, the most racist film in American history. Finishing up with the South, we're going to go back to industrial America, going back to the North, and our old friend Andrew Carnegie, who, whenever he sells his steel company to JP Morgan, he becomes the richest man in the world. And I guess after he retired, he was like, wow, I've done a lot of terrible things in my life in order to become rich and powerful. In fact, most rich and powerful people do terrible things to get to this position in life. And so I should try to use my money, use my wealth, use my power to make life better and try to improve society, try to invest in our community. And so both he and Rockefeller will begin, towards the end of their life, giving away money, donating to certain causes. Carnegie's heavily invests in education and arts, building libraries and schools and theaters across the U.S., but also in places like Africa and South America. And his book, The Gospel of Wealth, is all about this duty of wealthy people to benefit their community, to use their money for good, and basically, you save your soul by spending money. And when you give your money away as a rich person, as an incredibly rich person like Carnegie, it's what's known as philanthropy. Now, if you're poor or a member of the working class or anybody else, and you give money away, it's charity. But if you are rich and powerful and you give your money away, it's called philanthropy, and it's also a tax break. So even though we will get income tax and things like that, coming in during this period. If you are rich and powerful and you give your money away, then you can actually get breaks on your taxes. Or what you can do is create a foundation like Carnegie. Carnegie created the Carnegie Foundation and gave a bunch of money to it, and then wrote that off on his taxes. So if you're incredibly rich, then you can create a foundation in your name that you run, give the money, give your personal money to that foundation, and then write that money off on your taxes, even though you still have control over that money, because our tax law is written for the rich and powerful and not for everybody else. Next term, business and morals. Again, this comes from Carnegie's idea of the gospel of wealth, of the rich and powerful needing to use philanthropy and to make up for all the terrible things that they had done to help the less fortunate. So both Carnegie and Rockefeller will try to save their souls by spending money to help out those who are less fortunate. And there is this sort of push among certain people. You also have Henry Ford, who will push for better pay and days off for his workers so they can go spend their money in the economy and buy his car and travel and things like that. It gets into this term called classical liberalism. Again, instead, in political science, this idea is that the rich and powerful of society owe it to the people to provide this sort of help for them, to provide charity. But this also was a way for them to avoid things like welfare and taxes, because classical liberalism requires only that rich people use their money, or this idea that rich people should use their money, should do this, but it's not necessarily going to be, it should not be a law, it should not be required. It is simply the duty of rich people to help out their society. But if we try to do other things, then bad things will happen and people become lazy and dependent. So we should only rely on charity and not on any sort of government thing like that. There are some changes that come. Again, we have women living in cities. They're having to go to work to help support their families. And we talked about how even children are having to go work in order to help pay for things and pay for their family to live. But there is some improvement, especially among the well-off women in the country, because they are now more centrally located. They can communicate, they can organize, and they can begin to advocate for not only labor rights but also suffrage, which is a right to vote. Again, it does not mean suffering; it means the right of women to vote. Uh, we'll see a massive change in the way women are expected to be treated, especially when we get to the 1920s, as women are allowed a lot more freedom, a lot more independence, and even the ability to go get a job and get an education, and not just expected to be wives and mothers, and again, to have more say in the world and their government by voting. Our last term for this chapter is going to be popular entertainment. With the growth of a middle class and you have all these people living in cities, they're going to need a way to sort of entertain themselves. And you have the growth of theater, you have the growth of sports, you have the creation of the first amusement parks. Again, places like Coney Island, where New Yorkers can go and spend time with their family. You also have traveling shows meant to provide entertainment. This era, one of the most popular forms of entertainment and traveling theater is called vaudeville. Very slapstick humor, silly jokes, things like that. This is when we get the first sports teams for cities that travel around and compete with other sports teams in other cities. This is where we get, the beginning of Major League Baseball, football, and basketball really becoming big sports, and more people getting involved in that with the growth of the middle class and growth of cities. You also have the first silent films. When we get into the early 20th century, you get uh, film and radio becoming important. You get the first stars, people like Charlie Chaplin, which we'll talk about more when we get to the 1920s. So women are going to have a little bit more independence and a little bit more say during this. Men are still expected to be the breadwinners, still expected to sort of be more educated, but now women are able to have a little bit more independence and allowed to get an education themselves. You have in the bottom left an image of Coney Island, where again people could go and get ride rides, play games, and spend time with their family. Especially important for for this new growing middle class. And on the right, you have Andrew Carnegie, the great philanthropist, who became the richest man in the world, and then realized I should probably do some nice things because all I've done for my entire life is be a horrible person. And so he'll give his money away to charity and be the greatest philanthropist of the early 20th century. His foundation is actually still giving out money. The Carnegie Foundation, over 100 years after his death, is still giving out money and scholarships. And one of the most prestigious theaters in the entire country is in called Carnegie Hall in New York City. So he has had an effect long after his death, not because of his steel company, not because he was incredibly rich and powerful, but because of the good he did and because of the wealth that he spread and tried to improve people's lives. All right, moving on to our last topic, America. So we have manifested our destiny. We have moved all the way across the continent and conquered the continental United States, but that's not enough. We still need to keep going. We have this ever growing and expanding market and industrial economy that needs more and more resources. And so we've got to keep expanding. We got to keep growing. And as you can see from the image in the top left, one of the places we're going to try to go to is Asia. You have also Cuba, you have Colombia, this image of America trying on a hat that says world power. And in the bottom, you have the American flag wrapping around the world to represent American imperialism. So, what is an empire? An empire is simply one country controlling another. There's a lot of empires in history. Probably the most famous, of course, is the Roman Empire, but there's also the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great's empire, the Mongol Empire, which was at one time the largest empire, is still the largest land empire in our history. Then you have the British Empire, which is, of course, the one that America broke apart from, that colonized the world using its naval power. So you have one stronger nation taking over weaker nations, generally, of course, for the benefit of that stronger nation. And now, 100 years after our independence, it's time for us to build up our own overseas empire. One of the first couple ways we step out is in intervening in a potential war in China. China has become very, very weak, partially due to European involvement. You also have widespread unrest in the country itself. And Europeans see this as an opportunity to carve up China, much like they did in America and in Africa. And they're all threatening to possibly even go to war with each other over who will get to control China. And so President McKinley will step in and offer what's known as the open door policy, which is instead of us carving up China, instead of Europe fighting over and potentially starting a big war over who is going to control certain sections of China, why don't we just let everybody trade with China and allow anybody in who wants to trade with China? And when the Chinese government has a rebellion known as the Boxer Rebellion with a bunch of Chinese people who do not want this European intervention, do not want these people involved in their country, President McKinley will send troops to put it down, and that will help endear us to China. So we are now using our military to help put down Chinese rebellions, and we will begin intervening in other places in the world and expanding and sort of flexing our muscles. Another place we do is uh, in Mexico, our neighbor to the south. We have had a U.S. ally in there for some time, but he will be overthrown and killed in a bloody revolution in the early 20th century. And that's when our president, President Wilson, will send in troops to the port of Veracruz to prevent arms shipments reaching the revolutionary government. We also have, in 1916, a Mexican revolutionary named Pancho Villa will cross the Rio Grande and attack towns in New Mexico and in Texas. As a result, Wilson will send the army into Mexico to try to capture him. And after about 10 months of us shooting up a bunch of towns in northern Mexico, we will leave unsuccessfully after the Mexican government said, get out or we're going to war. And so there's a lot of instability with Mexico. We keep intervening, and it really hurts our relationship with Mexico. So Mexico's not happy with us right now. And that'll be important when we get to World War One. Our next one is American missionaries. Much like Spain and Britain, one of the ways that we spread our influence is through spreading of religion. You have Spanish missionaries spreading Catholicism in America and in Asia. You have, of course, Puritans, English Protestants spreading it here in America. Americans will begin sending our missionaries to places around the world to provide education, to spread religion, and provide aid in the Middle East. But we will actually not get a lot of converts, though they will build some hospitals and schools. This is sort of the introduction to American involvement in the Middle East, which, of course, will only greatly increase over the next 150 years. In this image, we have the American eagle spreading its wings over not only the continental United States, but also out to Puerto Rico and to the Philippines and Hawaii. You have this image of Uncle Sam standing on China and creating a trade treaty preventing the European nations you can see all standing with scissors from carving up China. And on the image on the right, you have Uncle Sam jumping the fence and going into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa. Now, one of the best ways to become a world power is to beat up another world power and take their stuff. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So one power that had really lost a lot of its empire in the last 100 years was Spain. At one time, they controlled everything from California to Argentina in the New World. So almost all of South America, with the exception of Brazil and Guyana. Most of Central America, with the exception of Honduras, and a big portion of what is now the southwestern United States. But by the end of the 19th century, all that was left was Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So these island nations. And they were desperate to hold on to it. So desperate, in fact, that many of these places were actually in open revolt against Spain. In Cuba and in the Philippines, there were major, major rebellions against Spanish rule, and the Spanish were being quite cruel to the rebels. One of the worst, of course, was in Cuba, which is not far from the US border. It's only about 90 miles from Florida. And there, the Spanish were forcing the native Cubans into concentration camps and killing anybody who disagreed with them. And this gets sensationalized in our newspapers. But also, we do have some American interest and we do have some American business in the area. So President McKinley will send the USS Maine, one of our new ironclad ships, to Havana Harbor, which is the capital of Cuba, to sort of say, hey, we're here to protect American interests, but also you should stop doing what you're doing. And sort of try to push Spain into making sure that our interests aren't messed with at the very least. But what ends up happening is on February 15th, in 1898, the Maine suddenly explodes, killing all 268 sailors aboard. Now, even though the Maine is one of these brand new ironclad ships, we're no longer using ships of wood. Uh, Instead, they're made of metal and they are powered by steam. Steam, which is created by heating up water using coal typically, uh, has a tendency to explode. And so, steam engines, while they are very powerful, are sometimes unstable and can randomly explode. We didn't know this at the time. In fact, a U.S. naval inquiry will blame it on a floating mine. And this angers a lot of Americans and forces the government to basically call out the Spanish and accuse them of destroying one of our ships and killing our sailors. President McKinley at the time is outraged by the treatment of the Cuban people. He, like I said, he sent the Maine to Havana, and after the explosion, he will very much try to negotiate with Spain, but could not prevent a war. It didn't help that the Spanish foreign minister was also not very nice to him and said a lot of mean things about his character and his weight. And it got to the newspapers. And at the time, you have people like Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, very rich, powerful media tycoons who owned all the newspapers, and they wanted war with Spain. And so they will use the explosion of the Maine and they will use the treatment of the Cubans to call for war with Spain. And they will sensationalize the news and push for the American people to call for war. And so we call them yellow journalists because while, yes, the Maine did explode and yes, it was in Havana Harbor, it actually had nothing to do with the Spanish. And yes, the Spanish were being quite brutal at the time, but it's not anything different than what we were doing to Native Americans at the time. And they, again, were trying to push an agenda onto the American people by changing what information they had. And ultimately, they will be successful. The American people will call for a declaration of war with Spain. Congress will vote to declare war on April 25th, 1898. The rallying cry for the war is "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And the war is over by August 12th. It is about 3 months of actual fighting. As the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, described it, a splendid little war because we got everything we wanted. We lost very little troops and had absolutely no losses in terms of battles. We won every battle. We won a very quick naval battle with the Spanish Armada outside of the Philippines. We also had victories in Cuba and Puerto Rico and Guam. One future politician, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, will resign to become a cavalryman and lead soldiers to victory at the Battle of San Juan Hill. And he will bring with him a reporter and a photographer, and who sends back stories of all his exploits and makes him a war hero in the American people's eyes. Cuba will end up becoming a protectorate, which is basically they're an independent country, but you're going to do what we tell you to do. And we will make sure you stay in power. And if you don't, then we will replace you. While Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines become territories. Now, Puerto Rico and Guam are still territories for the United States. So if you are in Puerto Rico, they are Americans. They have the same rights as we do, but where that changes is they do not have representation in Congress. So if you live in Puerto Rico, you live in Guam, you are an American, but you don't get to vote for president. You don't get a congressman. And so that causes some issues, of course, because they don't have representation, which is kind of that whole point of that war that we started in order to gain our independence from Britain. So you have here a painting showing the explosion of the Maine. You have the meaning of McKinley and Delon, the foreign minister from Spain, that I said did not go very well. A couple of titles from the New York Journal: Spain guilty, destroyed by a floating mine. It wasn't, but we won't know that until we dive down to the Maine 70 years later. And this massive reward for any information about the destruction of Spain, and this painting of Teddy Roosevelt at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Hawaii is very important because, like Guam and the Philippines and other islands, it'll serve as a refueling station that allows our ships to travel further to get to new markets, and also for our Navy to better protect our shipping lanes. Next term is Theodore Roosevelt, also known, of course, as Teddy Roosevelt. He was the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy who will resign to fight in the Spanish American War. His cavalry unit was known as the Rough Riders, and they will fight at the Battle of San Juan Hill. Or, as I said, he brought a reporter and a photographer who will write back to America with all of his exploits, making him a household name, a war hero. In 1890, when McKinley is running for re-election, he will name Roosevelt as his vice president. They will end up winning the 1900 election. So Teddy Roosevelt goes from fairly high-level bureaucrat in the nation, but probably not well known, to being a national war hero, then vice president with only a couple of years, and then, luckily for Roosevelt, not so lucky for McKinley, McKinley is assassinated in 1901. He is our third president assassinated within a few decades. We had Lincoln assassinated in 65. Garfield is assassinated a little bit later. Now McKinley is assassinated. So that's three American presidents assassinated within the last 50 years. And so Roosevelt will end up taking over and becoming president. He is the first a set of presidents we call the progressive presidents, because they will go and create a lot of new rules and ideas and policies that help increase government representation, government accountability, and regulation, although there are some glaring gaps, the things that they're necessarily, namely race. So they're progressive as long as you're not black or a person of color. So you have this image here, typically shown for American imperialism. As you can see, Uncle Sam has, let's say, put on a little weight, expanded. And you have these anti-imperialists who are basically saying, drink your anti-expansion medicine. And President McKinley, however, serving as a tailor, is dressing up Uncle Sam in expansionism and enlightened foreign policy. And the title of it is Declined with Thanks, which is basically thanks, but no thanks. We're going to keep growing. We're going to keep expanding our world empire. You also have a painting of Teddy Roosevelt. This is the Philippine insurrection on the right. Again, we will lose thousands of American troops in that battle. And you have his presidential portrait on the bottom left. Fun fact about Teddy Roosevelt: in addition to being a war hero, he's also an avid hunter, outdoorsman, conservationist. And while on a hunt in Mississippi, he will kill a bear, and a member of his hunting party finds a cub, probably because they just killed the mother, and offers to let Teddy Roosevelt kill him. But when Roosevelt declines, that story makes it back to the American people. And a New York department store owner decides to create a stuffed animal and call it the teddy bear. So that's where that particular kind of stuffed animal gets its name from. It's actually named after the president, Teddy Roosevelt. Besides the teddy bear, the thing that Roosevelt is most well known for is his foreign policy, typically called big stick diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Basically, our imperialist president is saying that we are going to negotiate, we are going to be nice, we're going to, help out, but we're ultimately going to use our military if we don't get what we want. And so this is in line with another imperialist at the time named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was the Secretary of the Navy. He wanted for us to expand, take more territories, gain access to new markets, and build a big navy. He will actually write a book all about the power of the navy based on Great Britain's navy and how they had used that to build up their world empire. And so Roosevelt will create what's known as the Great White Fleet, 16 brand new battleships that will travel around the world and basically show off American power. And even though we won't actually use them in a war, they do, again, look very impressive. And it will help push this idea that America is, now a world power and we're now going to throw our weight around. Tree. And Roosevelt will also add to the Monroe Doctrine, which we talked about. You should have learned in History 1301. Basically, this idea that America is in charge of this half of the world, the Western Hemisphere, and Europe needs to stay out. Now, with the Roosevelt Corollary, or corollary is just another word for addition, the Roosevelt Corollary is basically saying, not only, not only is this our half of the world, but we're going to use our military to enforce that and to prevent European influence and prevent European meddling in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere. So you have images like this one where you show Roosevelt serving as the world constable, literally using his big stick to sort of stand in between and enforce rules between different sides. One of the ways we do this is pictured in the bottom left is by negotiating the peace treaty between Japan and Russia, which had had a war, which everybody sort of expected Russia as a powerful European nation to win, but actually they absolutely got they actually got their butts kicked by the Japanese, and Roosevelt will help negotiate a peace treaty with them. You have this political cartoon showing Roosevelt sitting on a boat carrying his big stick, and you have this political cartoon about the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary showing us using our power, using our military to sort of tell Europe to keep its hands off the Western Hemisphere. And this comes after the Republic of Santo Domingo defaults on a bunch of loans, and the French and British basically try to take it over. That's when Roosevelt says, actually, no, we're not going to let you do that. So this is one of many examples of intervention in Latin America. As I said, the first time we will do this is stepping in to protect the Dominican Republic from being taken over by the British and the French after defaulting on their loans. In 1905, U.S. Marines will occupy the government to facilitate repayment. Once again, America is not really into this idea of imperialism, and so we try to sort of reframe it as humanitarian, as we're doing this for the benefit for them. We're not doing this for our own interests, but of course, it actually is to make sure that we are the policing power, that we are the one in control of this hemisphere, because that means we can basically make Latin America do whatever we want. And we will continue to intervene in Latin America for the rest of the 20th century, but also even into the 21st century, as we just so recently kidnapped a leader of a Latin American nation. Um, this will happen a lot, especially during the Cold War. Anytime any Latin American nation gets a little too communist, a little too socialist, or threatens any sort of our interests. One of our biggest interventions in Latin America will come in the form of the Panama Canal. Now, for most of our history, if we wanted to send stuff to the other side of the country, the easiest way will be by ship. But we have to go all the way down around South America. Now, that is about 16,000 miles, takes months, and is incredibly costly and time consuming. It'd be much better if we could sort of cut through the middle. Well, the French had the exact idea to do this. They had also just completed the Suez Canal, which allows ships to travel from the Indian Ocean up to the Mediterranean by cutting through the piece of land that connects Asia to Africa. They thought they could do the same thing here in this very skinny bit of land known as the Isthmus of Panama, basically the skinniest part of the land between North and South America. However, the Suez Canal is in the middle of the desert, and relatively flat land, Panama is much more difficult. It's mountainous. There are a whole lot of rainforest, and there's also mosquitoes with lots of terrible diseases. And basically, the French failed. At the time, at the time, Panama was also part of Colombia. And when we wanted to basically finish what the French had started, the Colombians said no. Well, Roosevelt, using his big stick diplomacy, said, that's fine. We'll just help Panama gain its independence, and we're going to use our Navy to make sure that you can't go take Panama back. So Panama will gain its independence, and one of the first things it does is give us permission to build the canal, which we do. And this is very, very important because it cuts the travel time in half in the distance. So we end up going only about 8,000 miles versus 16,000, and it saves 32 days. And time is money. So that is very, very important. And today, the Panama Canal is still one of the most important places that cargo can go through. In fact, nearly all container ships are designed specifically to travel through the very skinny locks at the Panama Canal. So, next term, 15, mentioned this earlier, this idea of spreading civilization, quote unquote, to uncivilized, again, quote unquote, parts of the world, mainly on the idea of spreading education, building schools, investing capital, giving money, but in reality, it's just colonization. This is one of the main excuses sort of pushed by American imperialists. The same excuse is also used by British imperialists and European and French imperialists. Anybody who wants an excuse to take over a weaker power, this is typically one, especially Europeans and white majority countries like to use. We have a couple of political cartoons here. We have Roosevelt digging through the Panama Canal. We have him marching around the Caribbean Sea with his navy and his big stick diplomacy. You have in the bottom right this woman in white armor, supposed to represent civilization, fighting up against barbarism, again, as an excuse for what is in actuality colonization. But their excuse is that they are spreading civilization and they're bringing education investment, helping to improve their lives, as long as they do what we say, and anybody who resists will be shot. We also have this scene over here, quite racist scene, showing Uncle Sam basically trying to educate these newly acquired territories. You have the nice white uh, students in the desk paying attention to their work to represent all the states that have already been there. You have the Indian boy sitting by the door, and his book is upside down. The Chinese boy that is outside because he's not let in, which we'll talk about in a second. There's also, although I've cut it out of this particular image, a very racist depiction of an African American boy who's listening in while he's cleaning the window. Again, this idea of spreading civilization, of you're going to learn, we're going to teach you how to act proper, sort of a thing that is both an excuse of, but also kind of a threat by the American government and American civilization at the time. Our next term is new immigrants. I sort of talked about this earlier, especially with the Life in Industrial America chapter. We're having a lot of new immigrants coming into this country from different places, the late 19th, early 20th century. We have immigrants from South and Eastern Europe. Many of them are going to be non English speakers, and they're not going to be Protestant. They're going to be Italian or Polish or Irish or Russian or Balkan, and they're going to be more likely Catholic or Jewish or Eastern Orthodox. And so we don't like that here in America. We want everybody to speak English, and we want everybody to believe like we believe. And so this leads to a rise in anti immigrant feelings. And at the time, that leads us into our next term. That term is nativism. This preference for native born Americans over immigrants. Now, there is sometimes some confusion. Nativism is nothing to do with Native Americans. This is basically just saying white people that are already here are better than these white people that are coming over. They're not the right kind of white people because they don't speak English and they're not Protestant. We don't want Catholics. We don't want non-English speakers in this country. Is of course something a nativist would say. Just an example of very anti-immigrant feelings. Today we use different terms like xenophobia, racism, but back then the term they used was nativism. One of the main things they want to do is restrict immigration from places they don't like, despite the fact, of course, if you're in America and unless you are a full-blooded Native American or you are the descendant of an African slave brought here against their will, you are an immigrant. That either you are an immigrant or you are the children of immigrants. But at this point, they're like, not you. We don't want you. We're done. We don't need any more. Whatever. Uh, some of the main groups that originally faced this criticism, especially from Europe, would be the Irish. They were considered drunken and disorderly and anarchists, which is why you have this image of Colombia mixing a bowl of citizenship, and you have the Italian screaming and holding a knife. It sort of goes into this idea that um, in this mixing pot, in this melting pot of America, the Irish won't fit in. Again, you have this image of immigrants seeing a Statue of Liberty. You also have this image of a drunken Irishman in a whiskey barrel and a German immigrant in a lager barrel, which is a type of beer. Again, we don't want this sort of painting immigrants as bad and as we don't want them in our country or they're bad for us. One of the most famous images from this period, political cartoons, is this one in the bottom left corner called Looking Backward. You have these rich men all standing there basically telling this new immigrant coming into the country, we don't want you here, don't come in. Even though, as you can see behind them, their past, their shadows, either them, their former selves, or their fathers or grandfathers who are immigrants who came to this country in exactly the same way. Looking for a better life, now they want to deny access to those, even though their fathers and themselves as well. Our last two terms, Chinese Exclusion Act. The other group besides the Irish that was heavily focused on during this period are going to be the Chinese. A bunch of Chinese men and laborers come over to America during the California Gold Rush, only for the gold rush to end very quickly and then to have not a lot to do. Many of them are leaving China because China is experiencing a lot of turmoil and there's not a lot of jobs. And China has always had quite a large population. And so all of these Chinese immigrants are willing to work for less than white people. They don't really have any rights or anything like that. So they're just kind of trying to do whatever they can to survive. And so this means there's competition for jobs. And there's a lot of anti Chinese sentiment, especially as California becomes a state. And so they will end up helping build the Transcontinental Railroad, the western half. But a lot of Americans, Californians, and even unions will push for the limit of immigration by Chinese. And so you'll have the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically says that we're not going to let in any more Chinese laborers into the US. And this law will last all the way from the 1880s, all the way until after World War II. Now, we did still allow in Chinese who were artisans or educated, they have degrees. So we basically only let in really smart Chinese people and not the common laborers because we didn't want them competing for jobs. We'll also have an agreement with the Japanese, and basically it means that there is no immigration from Asia into America until after World War II, unless you're smart, well educated, or some sort of skilled artisan, which sort of leads to this model minority myth about Asian immigrants being better than other immigrants. And our last term for this module in this chapter, Catholicism and American culture. As I sort of mentioned before, and you might remember me talking if you took my History 1301 class, there's a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in America, and this has existed since our country was founded. America is founded by Protestants for Protestants, and Catholics are considered either lesser or by some even this conspiracy that Catholics are going to try to come take over. And even that extends to the Pope. The Pope is going to try to come take over America, and that Catholics are more loyal to the Pope than they are to America or the president. And so we don't want Catholics in this country, and we certainly don't want any sort of Catholic politicians. And a lot of this anti Catholic sentiment will not only increase during this period when we have a lot of Catholic immigrants, but it will continue even until the 20th century. We don't have our first Catholic president in America until 1960 with John F. Kennedy. And we've actually only had two Catholic presidents in our entire history, John F. Kennedy and Joe Biden. All the rest have been Protestant. So there's a lot of fear of Catholics are trying to take over, the Pope's trying to take over. There's a lot of anti Catholic sentiment that will continue. So out of, I think the actual number of different men we've had, because two have been non-consecutive. So I think we have 45 different men that have been president in America, and all but two have been Protestant, and only two have been Catholic. Again, that's a good example of anti-Catholic sentiment. Of course, a lot of the immigrants we have coming to our country now are Catholic. Catholicism is one of the fastest growing religions in America. That makes a lot of Protestants, unhappy, even to this day. Although now we have an American Pope, which is certainly okay. So our last picture slide, we have Hip Hurrah, Chinese excluded. This is again celebrating the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Not everybody is in favor of this, especially some are going into sort of that anti-Irish feeling. We let in these anarchists and these drunken Irish people, but we don't let in the Chinese that are hardworking. You can see here the Chinese man who is left outside the Golden Gate of Liberty. He has with him industry, peace, sobriety. Of course, the Irish and the Germans and Eastern Europeans are all drunk and fighters and hoodlums, as they're described on here. We let in communist, socialist, nihilist hoodlums, but we don't let in Chinese people. Same thing here. You have the Chinese wall around the United States of America. And on the two images, on the two others, you have cartoons that are basically accusing the Catholics of wanting to take over America. You have the Pope, who is looking across the Atlantic Ocean at the United States, and the bishop at the American Catholic headquarters, the American Pope wanting to take over America. So that's the end of Module 2. So we've covered life in industrial America, the Gilded Age, capitalists, the robber baron, capitalist, captain of industry class, now American imperialism. So we've converted to an industrial economy. Now we are expanding across the globe, and we are conquering a world empire to help fuel that new industrial economy. And we have a lot of immigrants coming into this country to help take positions in those factories and hope for a better life, which is again helping to grow our economy, grow our population. But not everybody's happy about all these immigrants. And there's a lot of immigrants that we don't like, and some that we are going to get rid of completely. That is it for that chapter, for that module. So thank you and have a good day.